Hi and welcome everybody. We're very happy to be here and to be having this conversation with you all, focused on the question of what does an anti-fascist farming movement look like. The panel came about in response to the dominance of right-wing and populist voices in the recent waves of farming protests, and more broadly the rise and normalization of reactionary, racist and xenophobic nationalisms across the globe, as we've seen grow and fester increasingly in the past few years. We wanted to bring together here all those who are similarly concerned with the threat of rising fascism, and the fact that so many of you are here shows that this is a prominent concern in our movement. Our point today was less to theoretically or historically define fascism or what fascism is, but to think together about what our activism and our movement has to offer that refuses and challenges fascist and right-wing development within the farming movement. We reflect on some elements of what we see as also hindering or limiting the growth of an explicitly anti-fascist politics in our movement, which we might broadly call alternative farming or agroecology or food sovereignty movement, the banner under which we're gathering here today at the ORC. You might likely, or many of you might understand fascism in a sort of continuum from conservatism and right-wing ideology to kind of state fascism, characterized through overt narratives of white supremacy, of protection of a pure national body and populationism. Often, Western liberal democracy presents itself as a bulwark against fascism. But as we have been able to see very drastically and clearly over the past year, in our so-called Western liberal democratic governments, they have refused to stop an ongoing and explicitly stated genocide in Palestine, are actively negotiating with fascist governments, and have ramped up the repression against protesters trying to hold them to account. The promises of freedom, equality, and rights of these democracies, I should note, have always been experienced very differently by the poor, by racialized communities, by nomadic peoples, people without status, and by the imprisoned. And if we think more through the prism and the analyses of those facing the brunt of state violence, we can see how this simple opposition of fascism and liberal democracy looks a lot more troubled, as both fascism and liberal democracy are very differently experienced by those cast outside the framework of liberal rights and citizenship. So what we want to do here, and in this time, I think it's crucial that we complicate our analyses of fascism. Many anti-colonial thinkers have pointed out that fascism isn't just a European phenomenon, specifically or exclusive to Europe, but an expression of a global imperialist order. So anti-colonial thinkers have highlighted how the colonies were the place where fascism was historically bred, and Aimé Césaire famously describes how fascism in Europe is the boomerang, or the imperial boomerang effect, whereby the accepted violence that was inflicted or is inflicted on colonial population turns inward and is now affecting those living within the imperial core. So fascism, we understand it less as a static form, but as a process, and that's what we wanted to come here together to interrogate. So it's not just enough to call out the kind of blatant or overt fascistic and right-wing elements and say that we oppose this. That's also very important. But what we want to do here is that we reflect deeply on why these ideologies have such a strong grip, especially on the figure of the farmer or the narratives within farming movements. So the purpose here is not just to identify a kind of fascism as a threat over there, people or those conservatives ruining our progressive potential in our movements, but instead to critically assess the ability of our own spaces to counter fascist, right-wing, and racist rhetoric, and to provide a solid alternative to it. All of us on the panel here understand agroecology and food sovereignty as movements that are based in internationalism, in the refusal of racist nationalisms, and the imperialist dynamics that they grow from. In order to get there, we need to look inward and critically reflect on the kinds of political dynamics that are currently playing out in our movements, on the histories that it's emerged from, and on the dangers of too quick solutions that compromise this internationalist commitment. So that's what we want to do here today. And we'll first hear from Alex Heffron, who's going to offer up his reflections on the farming protests and on current European farming movements.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm Alex Heffron. I'm a farmer in the southwest of Wales, and I'm currently doing a PhD with Lancaster University, looking at post-Brexit changes to farming and farmland, including the protests. I've been involved with agroecology in some form for about 10 years now. So following on from Sophia's introduction, I would like to complicate and challenge some of the ideas of the far right and fascism as something that lies beyond the everyday politics of the neoliberal state. Instead, today's fascism is at least in part neoliberalism's own crisis response and just intensifies its own violent racist class structures. I'm trying to articulate something and I hope it comes across, but I'm happy to clarify further in discussion afterwards. All of us in this room are aware of the farmers' protests across Europe, and many of us would have walked past the tractors on the main road this morning. Underneath the protests is a legitimate set of grievances. Farmers are being forced to shoulder the cost of a green transition that they can barely afford. Meanwhile, fossil fuel companies continue to receive huge subsidies. The way governments are going about the green transition within the logic of austerity only fuels the potential of a far-right farmer backlash. But just to say quickly first that, in my opinion, in the UK, these protests are not dominated by the far right, but we must be clear that the far right does want to dominate them, and there are ways that I could see that develop. At the minute, they're more focused on immediate economic concerns, but also, I'm just thinking about a poll the other day looking at who farmers voted for in the last general election. 75% of farmers voted for the Conservatives or Reform, both of which I would characterise as far-right towards fascistic parties. So we also shouldn't underestimate that, I don't think. The far-right aspect of the European farmers' protests emerged most prominently in the Netherlands in 2022, where there was a substantial far-right faction led by groups such as the Farmers' Defence Force. They said the government was expropriating their land to provide housing for immigrants, which of course wasn't true. A new right-wing farmers' party was birthed, the BBB, who are now part of the right-wing ruling coalition. And the Islamophobic Geert Wilders managed to tap into farmers' support as part of coming first in the election. Coming back to the UK, Jeremy Clarkson is now a de facto agrarian populist leader, whether we like it or not. I know many farmers who love him, and I know many who may not like him but won't criticise him publicly. Recently, at the big London protests, he received by far the biggest cheer of the crowd for his speech from the stage. And similarly, Farage got huge cheers when he walked down the half mile of protesters, though he was rightly refused a place on the stage by the organisers. But I want to draw our attention to some lines Clarkson wrote in the Sun newspaper a few days before that. He said, "Starmer and Reeves have a sinister plan. They want to carpet bomb our farmland with new towns for immigrants and net zero wind farms. But before they can do that, they have to ethnically cleanse the countryside of farmers." This is, I think, especially grotesque and offensive in light of the Zionist genocide of Palestinians. Like the Dutch far right, he's appealing to the racist conspiracy theories of the so-called white genocide or the Great Replacement. In short, the racist and usually Islamophobic idea that white people are being gradually demographically replaced by immigrants. With this call to farming to defend the British land and the British nation, he's attempting to place farmers at the heart of that racist nationalist project. It speaks to a kind of blood and soil nationalism. The farmer as bulwark against Islam or as the defender of Western civilization. Here we can draw a parallel again to Israel and how it sees its own role within Western civilization. The vision for the UK is necessarily dependent on the wider European civilizational project. One that is clearly suffering the results of increasing contradictions and crisis. A project at risk, hence fascism. We've been here before, and we all have to fight it, but that doesn't mean defending liberal democracy. It means building a new world. British discourse is dominated by the dehumanising demand of stopping the boats. It's not just Farage, it's not just the Tories. Starmer boasts about deportation flights. In this way, the position between Clarkson and Starmer isn't as great as he likes to make out. Yet they have different visions for the future of the countryside. Yes, they do. But fundamentally, they're made of the same European cloth. Europe isn't just about the progressive bastion of human rights that we can be led to believe. Just in Ursula von der Leyen's time alone, as President of the European Commission, tens of thousands of migrants have been murdered in the Mediterranean and the European Atlantic. Europe could instead be providing safe passage and safe homes. And of course, this includes the UK. And includes Tories and Labour alike. The European border is a militarised, racialised death zone. That border, however, is crucial to the survival of European imperialism and of maintaining cheap food which keeps wages low. It's central to why there are workers in appalling conditions in the polytunnels of Andalusia and in the fields of Lincolnshire. Von der Leyen did include one reference to food sovereignty in her manifesto, which spends most of the other 30 pages discussing how she will further militarise the European border. I understand that we can feel pulled towards a politics of pragmatism, which can lead to a mindset of reformism from working within these institutions, but this then makes it more difficult to oppose those institutions and to build the radical alternative that food sovereignty envisages. There's no easy answer. I'm in favour of reforms that support smaller farms, but at the same time, moderately tweaking a violent racist system is not what food sovereignty stands for, which is a tension we have to work through. And in my opinion, just have this conversation out loud more often. I'm actually a bit ambivalent about the term fascism because it can be an exceptionalizing and dehistoricizing term. It's what we call it when, as Sophia made reference to it, Aimé Césaire, it's the colonial boomerang or the imperial boomerang returns to Europe. It can make us forget more than we remember. It can be wielded to protect and occlude the deep violence of liberal society, which is the feature of European society, not the exception. Islamophobia, transphobia, pogroms, the social murder of migrants, misogyny, these are all hallmarks of rising fascism, and all are becoming more and more commonplace. And yet all of it is baked into neoliberalism. None of it is new. We can find examples from every decade. This is why anti-fascism mustn't be focused just on resisting those... Sorry, rephrase that. This is why anti-fascism must be focused on resisting those processes and infrastructures that institutes fascism. We don't need to wait until fascism arrives. Sometimes when you're on a panel like this, you can feel like you have to come up with the answers. But to be totally honest, I'm just going to end on opening these ideas up as a question. How can we think strategically about the best way to develop food sovereignty in a world of rising fascism? And how do we relate to institutions with imperialist power? And I would say, how do we build what Sivanandan calls communities of resistance?
Thanks very much. We'll go right on, and then we'll come back in the end, and there will be plenty of opportunities for questions. We'll continue with Sagari Ramdas, who's going to give us a very insightful reflection, I think, on what happens when the things that maybe we're fighting for, of maybe a state-led agroecological transition or project, when that is achieved, but in a fascistic context. And I think, yeah, it's very interesting for us to reflect who we lobby for the changes that we're trying to make.
Thanks, Sophia. It's really good to be here. I'm Sagari Ramdas. I'm with the Food Sovereignty Alliance. We are an alliance of Dalit, Adivasi, other oppressed communities of food producers, but also non-food producers who come into this alliance because we fight for a vision of food sovereignty. I'm also a popular educator at the Kudali Intergenerational Learning Center. That's where we do a lot of our transformation work. And I'm also a veterinary scientist. For several years, I worked with very small livestock rearers, animal rearers, and a lot of my learning has come and continues to come from being with the community. And I'm also learning to be an agroecological farmer. So the interesting part about what's happening in India today, and I don't know how many of you continue to follow the entire farmers' movement, which of course in 2020, it reached a peak. There was strong mobilization across the country for over nearly 1.5 years, where there were farming groups across India, particularly in the northern part of India, in Punjab, Haryana, who led the struggle against our very right-wing government, which stands for a Hindu Rashtra or a Hindu, they want a formation of just a Hindu state. And they fought this government to repeal what were laws which the government had already enacted, which would essentially enable the capturing of the entire food system from farm to plate by the corporates, by the agribusiness corporates, by capital. After they repealed the farm laws, the state, of course, never gives up, right? So it has used insidious ways in which to ensure that agribusiness corporations will continue to take control. And of course, one of the major demands of the farmers' movement was that you owe it to us to ensure and enact a law for minimum support prices. And why minimum support prices? That is a commitment from the state that they will procure the produce from farmers and then distribute it through what is called India's public distribution system. Because as you know, nearly 80% of our citizens are today dependent on our public distribution system for basic food security, for providing basic food. And the interesting thing is that if it's one movement, and of course many of these farmers are middle-level farmers, some of them large farmers, some of them are, of course, there's marginal and small farmers. Agriculture workers also joined in the movement. And if it is a movement today which is questioning this fascist state of India, because yes, the Constitution of India, we are a democracy, but in practice, we are clearly following an ideology which wishes to promote the right-wing ideology of making it a Hindu state. And the movement which has questioned this state constantly has been this farmers' movement, both in terms of continuous, and right now as I speak, one of the key farmer leaders, he has been on a hunger strike for 41 days. And one of the big demands is you commit to the minimum support prices. Why? And you commit to not deregulating our markets. And why? Because by deregulating our agriculture markets, it's going to allow the corporations to just come in and take total control. So the interesting aspect is that the movement we would imagine would actually be least anti-government is now leading the anti-fascist movement. Meaning these are farmers, they are doing monocrop agriculture, they are in industrial farming. This is not because they wanted it, because I will not go into the history of what are the policies which brought them to where they are, but they today are questioning the government about its decisions regarding the ban on beef. They're questioning the government about its agriculture policy, which wants to insidiously again ensure that the corporations come in. They're questioning the government about its digitalization and bringing drones into farming and thus displacing workers. And who is the movement who is really taking the lead on it? They're questioning them for they're supporting Palestine. They're doing everything which we would never imagine that a farmers' movement would do. But they are, in our assessment from the Food Sovereignty Alliance, really showing the lead. Whether it was Punjab, whether it was Haryana, particularly in Punjab, which is the core of the movement, they voted against the BJP in our recent national elections. And the movement, which we would imagine, right, because it's alternative, it's not doing chemicals, it's not doing pesticides, it's what we call agroecology. We would imagine that this would be the movement who would be clearly anti-fascist, who would be calling out the government, who would be demanding, right? This movement has been silent. And I want to show a slide to try to understand and uncode and depack what is happening. And I don't know how to do this.
It's up.
Oh, it's up? Okay. I hope you can see that. I don't know if it's clear, not clear, but I'm going to try and use this as a reference. So it's interesting, and maybe I'm going to get up as well. I have this mic, so, okay. So if I come here, and if we look at the situation in India, we are a highly oppressed set of society by the structures of caste, patriarchy. And of course, there's huge, when we talk about the inequality of land ownership, it's massive. We have nearly 60% of our people who are food producers, and I say food producers because we only talk about farmers. We never think about the workers whose work and labor goes into the production of food, right? So it's the 60% of our communities living in villages today are landless. There are the top 5% who own 30% of the land. There are the bottom 50% who own 0.24% of the land. And when you juxtapose this against the terrible structure of caste, it is clearly Brahminism working and hasn't changed. So the majority of landless are Dalits. The majority of those who own the big land owners are Savarna, or the dominant castes. And then the rest fall in between. So there is this situation of massive land inequality, which for 75 years we've not been able to address. And it is on such a structure of massive land inequality that agroecology is being done by the state where it was once one state called Andhra Pradesh. Since the last 10 years, it's been 2 states. I am from Telangana, and there's Andhra Pradesh. And this has been the project which has been flagged and celebrated across the globe for being the most radical, the most path-breaking agroecology project of upscaling agroecology, right? And let's have a look at this. Let's have a look and actually see where is fascism working or where it is not. So we have this situation of land inequality, which juxtaposes very intrinsically with caste. We have a situation where the majority of the work being done is by the exploitation of the labor of women who belong to Dalit, Adivasi, and OBC communities, right? We have Brahminical patriarchy, so we have to understand the difference of patriarchy and Brahminical patriarchy. When we say a Hindu nation state, we're talking about probably the most earliest form of fascism that one can think of, created 4,000 years ago, which defines a human being based on on your source of birth, right? Which was the inspiration for fascism across Europe. It was the inspiration for race politics and race laws in the US. It is the system of caste, based on the fact that as a human being, you're born different. When you're born on the top, you are different, you're superior, and when you're born, and that's why Ambedkar talked about graded inequality. And to keep the graded inequality going on, you have to basically hold women in because women will keep doing that, right? So Brahminical patriarchy is about an Adivasi woman or a Dalit woman who does not have land will be forced to sell her labor. And this has become so critical for agroecology because agroecology, as it is being performed, when you don't have your land, you're working on someone else's land, right? We're also talking about the Brahminical knowledge system. So today the agroecology is saying that as you will not be allowed to eat beef. We're not talking about huge factory farmed animals. We're talking about animals which are part of farming, which once they become old, they are culled, they are slaughtered, and then of course we have people, one in every 13th person in India is a beef eating Indian. And today, the same agroecology only wants to talk about millets and pulses and vegetables. Wonderful, but what about the goats and the meat and the beef, which are all intrinsic part of our food cultures? So the knowledge which is coming down through this agroecology is a hierarchical form of knowledge which completely ignores the fact that Dalit women or Adivasi women are holders of knowledge because they may not have owned that land, but they are working on that land, right? And the most dreadful part about this whole system is that this is the substructure of inequality on which you have not addressed the question of land, you have not addressed the question of labor, and on this you have brought in then that whoever owns the land, we will do our mulching, our diversity, our biodiversity, our restoring of the soil, our principles of restoring everything on that earth, which has been, of course, the same state did 30 years or more of making sure they destroyed the land. Because 30 years before that, when Michelle, Tom and I, and a number of us were in India looking at what was there, we actually have in the same vision which wanted to create this situation of destruction, stated that 80% of seeds were already being held by farmers 30 years ago in the late 80s, early 90s. But you know, corporations want to benefit, so they ensured that that destruction happened. Once you created that destruction, now the same state players are saying, oh, chemicals are bad, oh, pesticides are bad, we have to now get back to agroecology. However, the way this agroecology is being financed, after so many years of destroying your land, the state owes it to the people to make sure that you pay people to be able to transform, right? But this is a privatized transformation. It's a financial system where you pay. Who pays? The one who owns the land. You have to put in your private investment and pay. And where's that money coming from? It's coming from banks. It's coming from financial investment. It's the entire financialization of this agroecological transformation, where the state is hand in glove with agribusiness corporations and banks, getting loans, getting all kinds of investment, passing it on to small and marginal farmers to make them then transform their farming from chemical to non-chemical. But it continues to be a commodity production. Because if you're in a debt cycle and you're trying to get out of debt by taking more loan, are you really going to be in a position to diversify your soils, diversify your land? No, not at all. So they talk about one or two main crops. And then what is the logic of where you sell those? You will sell it back through agribusiness corporations. And finally, that agroecological commodity food will go to the elite consumers. Could be national, could be international. And what do the producers, the food producers eat? They will continue to eat chemical farmed food. And the state, of course, is standing today guarantee to both agribusiness and to banks. The state, year on year, writes off millions of rupees of loans given to these huge big agribusiness. You must have heard of Adani and Ambani. And the same Andhra Pradesh agroecological project links up the agroecological produced food to the agribusiness Reliance, which is owned by Ambani. And what does the state not guarantee? It does not do anything for genuine land reforms. It has, in fact, it has worsened. It has removed 8-hour restrictions on labor. Now you can work, workers can have to be worked up to 16 hours and it's okay. It's okay. Rural employment, our budgets for rural employment, we have something called the Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Those budgets are shrinking year on year. No commitment to minimum support prices, no commitment on public procurement of agroecological food for public distribution. So in this story, what you see is that this movement has not spoken out. This movement is basically held together by the state. It's not a movement. I don't even know where that name came from. It's not a movement. It's a state-controlled system through which everybody just wants to focus at this level. The soil. Regenerate your soil. But who owns that soil? It's very closely linked to who owns the land. And so, in this kind of a system, this system has not spoken out against any of what is happening in India today, whether it's a Hindu Rashtra, which is right-wing. This system incorporates in it the new digitalized world of how marketing happens. It bypasses, it doesn't need regulated markets. It actually has invited agribusiness to come and facilitate marketing so that anybody here sitting in the room, you can also purchase produce from this agroecological production. So I ask you at the end of this, therefore when we talk about something like agroecology, we need to look at this entire structure. We cannot limit ourselves to looking just at the level of the soil and what is happening there. We have to understand that this system is clearly exploitative, particularly exploitative of the most marginalized women and the communities. And finally, when my comrade Michelle and I wrote about this, there is the fascism of the community of academics talking and writing about agroecology. Everybody was very unhappy. Okay, if you're unhappy, critically write out publicly against it. No, no one has. But there's a silence. You don't want dialogue. You don't want conversation. So in my view, that is fascism. That's what fascism does. We don't question. We don't speak out. We keep silence. And finally, genocide happens. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sagari. Thanks. I'm going to pass on to Tom now, but I just wanted to say, when we think through like this, for example, or cautionary tale, when we're trying to lobby increasingly fascistic, increasingly right-wing governments for our future, which makes sense to some degree, like you were saying, pragmatism, but I think this is like a very important case and view that we have to have in mind, and I think the questions that you raised are really important, and we're going to return to it after. And as we're all gathering here at the ORFC, I think I'm really excited now to hand on to Tom to do a bit of looking back and looking forward with kind of the histories of the movement that we're all maybe understand ourselves part of, at least I do.
Thanks so much. It's lovely to be here. Hello, everybody. My name's Tom Wakeford, and I work as a consultant for Seeding Reparations. Seeding Reparations is an initiative whose aim is to transform food and farming systems in ways that support efforts to repair the harms inflicted by European colonialism as we work towards an alternative world to the capitalist one in which we live now. Today, I want to talk a bit about apples. I want to talk a bit about the trees that grow apples, rotten apples, and I also want to talk about organicism and the legacies of fascism. One of the things I've learned over the past 3 years of working with colleagues in Seeding Reparations, particularly from one colleague, is about the importance of acknowledging emotions. When we watch media coverage of the far right and racism, we're bombarded with images and stories, understandably, from people who are affected. In BBC Panorama's coverage of the 2024 riots, they had a really moving section of people who had been physically hurt by the rioters in Middlesbrough. I recommend it. But one thing that isn't looked at often is the emotions experienced by the people who are neither directly affected by the far right, but also not those displaying the anger, often violent anger as the far right, but the rest of us. For example, people who are white, like me and a lot of you. What Ros Norton, my friend who was a working class woman from Hull, would call middle class white do-gooders. So exactly a year ago, I had an emotional reaction to someone else, also a white man like me, coming up onto the stage at ORFC and doing what I thought was a strange ceremony involving an apple tree. Maybe some of you saw it or were there. Reflecting on it, as we travelled here this year, I had to admit to myself that there were several emotions going on for me, some anger, but also maybe some competitiveness. Maybe I was like, that's something cool. Maybe I'm feeling in competition with that. And I grew up in a patriarchal society in the 1980s, in which competitive individualism was worshipped. We are just meters away from New College, University of Oxford, from where a certain zoologist and fellow of the Royal Society, like the current owner of Twitter, by the way, popularized the myth of the selfish gene, which he and many others used to suggest that competitive individualism was literally encoded in every organism's and every human being's genes. So I've been reflecting on the mixture of emotions that were running through me which last year someone stood on the main stage and carrying out a ceremony that celebrated the Englishness of an apple tree. Hint, they came from Central Asia, and not a farm in Oxfordshire. And what this taught me about how hard it is for us, and maybe particularly men, to cooperate with others in an era in which we're all encouraged to compete with one another. And talking of emotions, I suspect some people are seeing the very title of this session maybe giving them an emotional reaction. Maybe you've bumped into people or heard people talking about it, like to use the time of a conference about the science of real farming or agroecology to talk about politics. But maybe this was mixed with fear. What would happen if they came along? Would the finger be pointed at them? Staying on the theme of apples, I wonder how many people know the story of a farmer called Jorian Jenks. I wondered if you could give me, just as a little straw poll, a show of hands, a bit harder online, but for those of you here, those who have heard at least the outline of the role Jorian Jenks played in the movement for organic farming in Britain. So I promise not to pick on you, it's hands up. Sometimes I do stand-up comedy, but I won't be doing any crowd work today. So just hands up if you know broadly the outline of the Jorian Jenks story. Yeah, I'm going to pick on the guy in the blue jumper. No, I'm not really. So thanks. That's quite a low proportion. I'd say maybe less than a quarter, a handful in a room of like a couple of hundred. Jorian Jenks lived up till 1963. I think he was born the last decade of the 19th century. He believed in organicism, the philosophical position that states that the universe and its various parts, including human societies, ought to be considered alive and naturally ordered, much like a living organism. Jenks was also a fascist. Like lots of followers of organicism, such as the popular writer Hugh Massingham, he believed in an authoritarian government and was a key member of the British Union of Fascists, whose leader, Oswald Mosley, literally wanted to lead Britain in the same way Adolf Hitler led Germany at the time. For many years, it seems to have been a tacit assumption among many believers in organicism, and that includes many of those speaking at conferences like ORSC, that Jenks had just been a case of a bad apple. An isolated, rotten little apple in a big barrel of good apples, the rest of which were basically okay. Among the countless supporters of organic farming, he was the one that went rogue, tragically giving the UK's history of organic farming a bit of a bad name. Now, this bad apple assumption has a bit of history, which some of you may know, and I'll very briefly summarise this. When I was 10, almost exactly 44 years ago, on the 18th of January 1981, 13 black people were killed in a fire in a block of flats in South London. It became known as the New Cross Fire. The police completely failed to investigate the potential that this fire was a racist attack, despite several lines of evidence suggesting that it was at least a possible cause. This, alongside the harassment of people in colour in the UK, particularly by the police, led to a series of violent protests against racism. Margaret Thatcher's government commissioned a senior judge, Lord Scarman, to report on the riot's causes. His report said that the police were generally not racist, apart from a couple of bad apples. It took the deaths of many more people of colour across the UK, most famously that of Stephen Lawrence, whose murderers have still not been brought to justice, for a later government to commission another judge, Lord Macpherson, to examine what was going wrong. He flatly contradicted Scarman, saying that the police were institutionally racist. 3 years ago, in the 75th anniversary edition of its magazine, the Soil Association, as you know, the organisation that certifies a lot of organic produce, founded in 1946, it published an article which did not hide behind the idea that the fascism present among the early supporters of organic farming was just a few bad apples. It stated, "There has never been a better time to confront the ways organicist thinking raises uncomfortable questions of race and belonging." I agree. I would suggest that white supremacy and an organizational disregard for the inequalities produced by our current economic system is currently institutionalized throughout organizations at the heart of British farming, and it has been for at least 100 years. And so it logically follows that this culture of white supremacy must have made its roots into organizations, some of them founded 70 or 80 years ago, that are to some extent at least represented at this conference. That's unless all the leading organizations involved in this conference have got together and decided to address it without the rest of us knowing it. And I think we can agree, with some notable exceptions in recent years, they probably haven't. And saying that you're just sticking to the science is not a get-out-of-fascist jail card, right? It's more complicated than that. Western science has been just maybe more complicit in white supremacy as organicism. And there's also the issue of social class, which plays a big part in sustaining the conditions in which the far right thrives. I don't think it's any coincidence that The Guardian's analysis of the communities where the riots took place in July and August last year, their analysis was that the people that took part in them were deprived and in bad health. Here, in the 6th richest country in the world, where lots of us, including me, choose to pay double or more for organic food where they can find it, we have this situation. And now we have tech billionaires who want to back what they call nature-based solutions and various other fun terms, but which are actually attempts to take us towards a future, as Alex pointed to, that seems to have as much in common with fascist thought as Jorian Jenks, and Sagari pointed to it as well in Andhra Pradesh. I don't know the figures, but I suspect before long, Amazon will sell more organic food in many cities in the UK than anyone else. Its billionaire boss wants to take a small number of chosen people off to colonize other planets in the solar system, while the rest of us are left to rot. So my question is the organic movement and its allied movements represented here at ORFC going to organize, not only to oppose the visions of these powerful figures, but also to recognize that hunger is a fundamental force that drives the rise of fascism, and therefore to work to ensure that the right to food is enshrined as a fundamental human right. I mentioned that I was based at Seeding Reparations. Our small team has been working on a fully referenced little booklet on organicism and fascism in the UK. It's called A Little Book of Legacies. We're hoping that it can make a positive contribution to taking forward some of the themes we're discussing this afternoon, and will be touched on other sessions, such as one on reparations within modernity tomorrow. So there are enough copies for everybody here, and you can pick up one as you leave, or people online. I think somebody's going to helpfully put one online as well. There's some good news. In October of last year, the German Biodynamic Standards Organization, Demeter, definitely part of the organic movement there, with links back to Rudolf Steiner, and quite a fascist movement there, they published what they called their clear position against right-wing extremism, which noted that right-wing extremists, and I quote, "right-wing extremists are trying to gain social acceptance by engaging in nature conservation and organic farming." It further suggested that it's more important than ever for organic farming associations to take a close look and clearly distance themselves from these groups. The UK hasn't faced the equivalent of Germany's post-war attempts at denazification in respect of its own colonial violence. But I think, at least since the summer of 2021, we have begun to follow Baldwin's dictum that nothing can be changed unless it's faced. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation between us for the next 20 minutes maybe, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions. But I first wanted to give the panelists the opportunity to be in conversation. You're welcome to ask each other questions on your respective presentations if you want, or I can start with us off with a question as you prefer. I see, Alex, you've written some flashcards, which is awesome.
Made lots of notes. Sagari, I found that like absolutely fascinating. Yeah, like so much. Just like use the word cautionary tale, right? It's exactly what I'm kind of like worrying about when, if as a movement we have to, how do we, relate to imperialist structures and states and power? And I think there's a lot that we should be learning from what you're talking about in Andhra Pradesh. I don't know, this is just too big a question, but like, what do we do differently? What would be the alternative to that? Is there an alternative there in Andhra Pradesh too? And then you talk about the farmers' movements there and how politicized they are in a good way. But yeah, I don't know, is that too broad or?
I mean, it's broad. But it's also, I think that, so also don't get me wrong that the farmers' movement is it has its own complexities, which there's a huge tension there between the agriculture workers and fighting for land with the landed, because, in fact, Punjab is a state where 30% are Dalit landless people. But what I'm trying to say is that there is, I think, what we are realizing is that it's important, especially when a state, and I go back to Andhra Pradesh, for 30 years, it's literally used the power of authoritarianism to silence. It's dismantled every structure of kind of, and allowing market to come in. And that process there's a lot of silencing which happens. There's also a generation which has changed. But I think the strength that we have is the power of continuous investigation, continuously facilitating people to actually investigate and interrogate the reality. Because today the reality is masked. You see, when the state comes to play and the state is doing this, you will there's an intrinsic kind of a trust, right? You're trusting the state. So there's this huge, especially when you have increasing the kind of inequality which has grown. The inequality, the hunger, the persistent hunger, which is masked because we have a Brahminical patriarchy society. So I come down to that. It's able to sustain and sustain and sustain because women at the bottom of the heap, these are Dalit women, OBC women, this is part of your oppression that you have to keep doing. You work overtime in your homes, you work overtime in your fields, you work overtime, then you're also taking up jobs. And there are women now who are traveling, hundreds of kilometers to just go and work somewhere. So I think for us, it's about when we begin our work, our political education work with women from the oppressed and marginalized communities, that's where liberation starts. Because there was I learned from the Philippines and the movements in the Philippines that those who are the most oppressed are those who are most advanced. And the most oppressed are the ones, and these are the women who are now taking the lead in their liberation struggle. And it is not going to be a quick fix solution. So I don't buy this argument, we have no time, climate change, climate crisis, therefore every means justifies the end. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It really doesn't, You're dying now. There are women who are, we have the most oppressed women. They are malnourished. They're overworked. They face so much of violence. So we begin our organizing with the most oppressed women because honestly, that's where, and then through them, the conversations with their allies in their families, in their communities, which are the men folk. And then, of course, across genders, and we're building the allies. And I would say the second point is building the allies. You have to build allies with the anti-caste movement. I mean, for us, the other big challenge is caste. I'm able to sit, so to liberate from that caste is just an idea. It's 4,000 years of having been brainwashed. So to liberate from that means you need the time for the education and the liberation begins there. So I would say that, that's my very short response, a long response.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sagari, could I just ask for a little bit of clarification? Because unfortunately, certainly my history education, I'm not a historian, and the history at school is like Cromwell, Nelson, whatever, Napoleon. We don't do anything on colonial history, and we certainly don't do anything about the Indian caste system and Britain's interaction with it. Could you tell us what is a Brahmin and how that connects with what's happening with agroecology in India? Because you touched on it various times, but I think I need a 101.
So the ideology of the caste system is Brahminism, where, of course, it was those who are the most powerful, which was the Brahmin, developed this idea that the human being, we're not all the same. That if you are born as a Brahmin, you're superior. And if you're born as a Dalit, you're untouchable. And that is sacrosanct, will never change it reproduces itself over thousands and thousands of years. And they created the Shastras, or they created their books and the prayers to keep on justifying and reinforcing the system of what Ambedkar defined as the system of graded inequality, meaning you're inferior to someone and someone else is superior to you. So you're constantly, and then of course they said you will have to you have to do good in many, many years, and then you may later get born again as a Brahmin. The point is that today, if you look at society in India, 90% of whether it's academia, whether it's colleges, whether it's education, whether it's employment, is still dominated by people whose privilege of 4,000 years continues to populate this sector. So they are the powerful, and not just Brahmins, but the dominant caste structure. So in that dominant caste structure, and it's, as I was showing, it's very closely linked to land. So you may have your education, but you'll keep investing in land. You're the ones who do the real estate. You're the ones who are investing in business. So the entire system today is tied up like this. And so therefore, if we don't look at caste, patriarchy and class together, we will never be able to actually, address the system. And therefore, when recently I read, there was one response to our critique of this agroecology. But women are populating the SAG group and handling all the finances. We have to understand, in a Brahminical patriarchy society, as a Dalit woman, your locationality is very, very different from if you're a Savarna woman, you're a woman from a dominant caste. Because we cannot look at patriarchy, it's like the whole issue of race, the whole patriarchy cannot be just homogeneous. It's not. It's really, so you have to look at and understand who are the women who are populating these SAG groups? Who has got the money? Whose money is being collected and then banked and then once again returned as credit? Right? And these are the systems which, when we are in a movement looking at agroecology, let's not be ostriches with our heads in the ground. This is what's happening. This is being spread to other countries. This is going to Mexico. This is the model now going to many, many other countries. Is this a model of justice? Is the question we need to ask. It's not about just soil justice. Because even soil, if you look at composting, I'm sorry I'm responding. We compost in my family. Depending on how much you eat, right, that much of vegetable waste or fruit waste gets generated and you compost. In my family, what we compost in one day, there are marginal Dalit women, in their families, they may be generating the same waste in 1 week. They don't have leaves to collect for the composting because our commons have gone. They don't have land where you're going to collect leaves. So how are we talking about this without looking at the structural base of equality and inequality, right? So let's get out of just getting caught in composting. I mean, I love biodiversity and mulching. I do it all the time. But if we are not conscious of this, we get fooled. We got fooled. We got fooled by this. Every anti-capitalist academic was busy supporting this. And I don't know where did your analysis go? Yeah, so I don't know. I went beyond your question.
And I think the two questions that you raised are the question of land and the question of labor. And those are questions that are also being raised here, I think, especially recently. We've got people from SALT really raising and asking the question of labor within the agroecology world, not only within the conventional farming movements. And the question of land has been raised again and again, I think across the last few RFCs anyway. There's always been a session on, you just did one, right? And these questions that you raised are just as pertinent here. I wonder if either of you have a word to say on that, or I mean, I know you do.
Okay, I'll go first on that one. Yeah, I'm just trying to bring together a few ideas that come to mind around something, because like workers' power comes up. Everyone's mentioned it in some part of what we've each said. Tom, you were talking about, you know, the hunger, and then the billionaire class, and how hunger is driving politics in a way. And one idea that comes to mind here is something I've been trying to think about, and I don't know, it's still like trying to develop this thought, but it's around this idea of what it's called class suicide. It's an idea written about by Amilcar Cabral, who is a Guinea-Bissawian anti-colonial revolutionary, 60s and 70s, was assassinated, I assume by the Portuguese colonial powers. I'm not entirely sure who was assassinated him eventually, but was part of the independence struggle for Guinea-Bissau from Portugal. And he talks about class suicide, and what he's talking about is this class position of the petty bourgeoisie, which you could look at. There's kind of two main branches of that, and this come up again and again over the course of this session so far. Is one would be those who are the landowners and business owners, and the others would be those in some position of power in organizations or institutions. So like academics would be one, or maybe a position in civil society. So this position has power to an extent within the system, but it's also a position of some struggle and tension, because you've got the bigger kind of, as you mentioned, like the billionaires, you know, that obviously above that, and all the finance companies, all these other ones. So this class can break either way in revolutionary moments or in radical moments. There's a lot of writing about the petty bourgeoisie and how they supported Nazism, you know. But then it's not a class that can just be disregarded. It's not like an inherently reactionary class. It's a class that faces its own real struggles, and those towards the bottom of that class are trying to not be workers. They're trying to hold on to what they've got, and some within that class are also trying to get ahead and build more power. So the idea of class suicide is, how can the petty bourgeoisie realize that the revolutionary task means that they must ultimately sacrifice their power and side with the workers in the revolution? Otherwise, that bigger goal doesn't get achieved. And I think, like, for food sovereignty and agroecology, that's something we can really think to, because the movement is generally dominated in positions of power by those who are landowners and business owners, or in academia and civil society, and that's me as well. I'm a landowner, I'm now in university, and so on. So how do we use our position to undermine ourselves in order to build a bigger movement? Because agroecology requires a lot more hands on the land by definition of what we're trying to achieve. So how do we work together for that and actually support and strengthen and build the workers' power within the movement, which for me is also crucial to fighting fascism, because fascism is also the capitalist class and how it reacts to times of crisis and tries to reimpose or reinforce itself or renew itself in society. So yeah, we need to build a bigger movement in order to fight that. Yeah, some thoughts.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. I have a question to either of the three of you, because I'm very curious about so the farmers are protesting, and it's a very conservative, fascist kind of, that's what, through what I've understood. And there must be a huge backlash, or what, I'm trying to understand the relationship to immigrant workers. Or, I mean, are the workers, like what exactly, what is that landscape looking like? Is it like cross borders? And how is the politics of between, like whether it was Brexit and now EU and the Ukraine war and Russia, and how is this entire landscape actually impinging upon labor and land? And how do you see this, in the larger kind of building solidarity or building, where are those spaces? Yeah, just trying to understand that.
Yeah.
The composition of like the farmers' protests here are, I think, mostly the farm owners who can be, who also work as farmers on the land. I don't want to say that's the same as being a worker, like it's a different position, right? But generally speaking, I think that's how it is in the UK. That's not to say that there aren't farm workers at the protests. I think there are. And that's not to say that there aren't farm workers who support the protests, because I think there are. The composition work of that, like who makes up the farmers' protests, is something I'm researching and trying to look more at, because I still don't really fully know in this country anyway. But what is very clear, what is absent, is the migrant farm worker, which I think in the UK is around 50,000 migrant farm workers. I mean, it's just not, it's not in the discourse, they're not involved with the protest. The kind of demands that you get a lot of the time from within farming and farming organisations is, we need more labour. We need, British horticulture. If we want to grow British horticulture, we need more workers for British horticulture. And that will often mean super exploited migrant workers coming over to do that, the backbone of that labour. So generally speaking, I think with farming and farming organisations, that's the kind of relationship to migrant workers. And I don't think... one other interesting aspect of the farmers' protest, I think, is how the far-right aspect of them is sort of fraternalising or building networks across countries, which is one of the key kind of characteristics of the far-right, is that kind of fraternal networks, or those, this person knows that person. So the BBB party that started in Netherlands influenced the beginning of an Irish party, which didn't get anywhere, hasn't got anywhere so far at all. But you go on the Irish party's website, the Farmers' Party there, and it's very clearly very right-wing, So yeah, I would like to see more of like an internationalist approach from agriculture and food sovereignty across borders. It's not easy. Obviously, we're very locked into the idea of nation states and thinking within our own terms. I do it, it's hard to get out of. Partial answer.
I've got nothing to add. That was
way
beyond my knowledge.
Yeah, I think it varies a little bit from country to country. It's slightly different in France. It's slightly different in Germany, where I'm based. But I think what is interesting is, how they're influencing each other. Like Alex just mentioned, like there's been kind of, experts sort of from the Dutch case coming to Ireland and speaking there, and people modelling after that. And I think that's another point that I wanted to raise or like think about, is how effectively far-right networks are actually networked across borders and actually very internationalist, even though people are largely thinking through like a racist nationalisms. There's a very, very strong practical networking also through think tanks, through funding networks of the far-right, way better than those of us who would maybe, those of us on the left, or also the agroecology world, that is being networked, but it's largely networked also through large organizations and funders and not really through grassroots collaborations. So as you say, our movements are largely stuck on like a national level of trying to lobby and advocate within our national governments, push for reform, land reform and better legislation, but it's not networking across borders. That's why I think, as you raised the question of migrant organizers is really key, because that is not really seen as something that is kind of inherent to the agroecology movement here. It's kind of seen as like a problem of big ag, and it's over there, which is failing, I think, our internationalist commitments in our movements as well. I wanted to just come back and kind of round off before we go into opening up for questions. Two elements. I think one, Tom, you invited us to look into the history of the movement that we are in here, and thinking about how that has roots in fascist ideology, in white supremacist ideology, and this question of purism, organicism, how that continues on today. I wanted to invite kind of all of you, actually, because also I know in India that is also very pertinent, to reflect on how those kind of ideas of what is natural, what is organic, what is inherently morally good, how that actually seeps into white supremacist notions of a pure body as well, and how you see that articulated within our context in the agroecology world. And then finally, I just wanted to ask or bring in this idea of the farmer. I think we've spoken about it a lot in different contexts. Again, I think we come back to always asking who actually is the farmer? The farmer is such a huge category, it's such a broad term, and there are many different types of farmers, as we know, and there's many different kind of land relations, labor relations, and class relations obscured within that category. So even though we speak in the name of small-scale farmers, I think it's interesting to interrogate that, and I also wanted to ask how that figure of the farmer is invoked, and people have a very strong emotional attachment, but to that category, people in the organic or alternative or agroecology movement, just as much as kind of big farmers. And so I think that's a question we always come back to, is that a useful category to rally behind? What do we want to do with it? How do we want to specify maybe who is actually part or the protagonist of our movements? Again, because migrant farm workers are never called farmers, even though they're the people who are majority on the land and doing the work, and just as much farm workers are not always actually considered the farmers themselves. So do we still want to think about that category or through that category, or is there other kind of core movement protagonists that we have? And then we'll open up for questions.
I mean, I could just give a very quick response on the first one. I mean, I'm very much jack of all trades. I'm not a historian or an anthropologist or anything like that, but I think going through the historical literature, and I should say our little booklet is fully referenced, and you can argue about whether peer-reviewed stuff is up to much, but it is referenced. Reading those papers by quite a few historians, this idea of purity, I hadn't realized how in the early 20th century that this idea of purity had become a big thing. And I think maybe, again, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a historian of religion, but I think maybe the link to sort of Christian's idea of purity and whiteness, the same that drove colonization, that the white pure missionaries, whatever, will go and save the people in these heathen lands, and so purity and whiteness being right at the beginning of organicism is I found really unsettling, and having proudly as a teenager gone, oh, I get a veg box from an organic grower, and I'm now thinking, wow, if only I'd known, I might have deliberately avoided, it's a bit like in India, I'd rather go to your farmers blockading in Delhi, growing monocultures, and maybe have, some less pure food than get it from people who are unthinkingly following this pure line. So, yeah, I mean, I guess what at Seeding Reparations we're thinking about is how we reorientate these discussions, which is happening at ORFC, and I guess the whole point of being here is being a critical friend, and saying there are some fantastic things happening by groups like SALT and Lion and all sorts of groups here. But if we reorientate towards justice, then why are we even using the term purity? What does it even mean to say pure in the notion of food? It reminds me of a scientist, a pro-GM scientist, who would say about, she didn't think dirt was pure, so you should have more chemicals, and because organic stuff had too much dirt on it. The whole, what is purity? It's you can mess with it until it becomes meaningless. So, yeah, that's my random ramblings on that.
I mean, India, the whole concept of purity, again, is so steeped. It's a core character of the system of caste, right? So you're impure, you're untouchable. Certain foods are impure, because you eat it, you're untouchable. That's why the whole Indianization of the food cultures is basically just completely smashing out the fact that we have such diversity in our food tastes, in what we eat, what we cook, taking eggs of the state, playing a role taking eggs out of midday meals, because it's informed by this notion of what is pure and what is not pure. So I think this fact of constantly challenging that the pure is not, and of course I also say that because, the India which has been sold to the West, the India sold to the global North, and the India also sold through natural farming, agroecology, the spiritual, the vegetarian, the non-meat. It is problematic because you are completely ignoring the true wealth of both knowledge, practice, and the way it happens is to make, because you already have a system of caste, is to make any marginalized community feel that their loss of dignity, if I eat beef, I am less human, so therefore you hide, you pretend not to. So I think this concept of purity is what we are challenging. It's intrinsic when we are talking about caste annihilation. When you're talking about the anti-caste movement, food is core to that. We cannot just talk about millets and pulses and because how can you, when you have very intrinsic part of it is where you live, what you eat. So, that's and I think we need to really move away. From the whole spirituality of this. The spirituality sold to the global North is the spirituality of Brahmanism. We need to recognize it, we need to fight it. We need to really very, very proactively counter it through our international, build it as part of our movements. And I can't remember your second question was, what was that? Your second, was there another part of it? Or?
There was, but I'm also seeing that it's quarter past and
so
I really want to...
that's my response.
I can come back, but I would like to give the opportunity for people to ask questions. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I also have some online. So I'm going to start with one online, and then I'll go to the room. So we've got... I think this is a really important one. So how can we differentiate between, from Lynn, who's a volunteer here, how can we differentiate between greenwashed nature-based solutions and real solutions? I think that's a whole question that all of us are grappling with.
I mean, I'll give a very brief response, and Sagari and Alex, and you can add, but I guess basically if it comes out of a corporation, which most of these nature-based solutions do, then rather than coming out of, are new technologies the limiting factor on tackling our climate crisis, our food crisis? No, they're not. So when a corporation says we need one and give it a nice name, then that's a signal. So I think it's not to say you reject any process of innovation. Unfortunately, it is wholly controlled by the billionaire class at the moment, almost completely controlled. I know there are fantastic farm hacks and French initiatives and North American and UK initiatives, but generally that's the case. So I think like coming to things like this and talking to people, going to things like, I hope the Land Skills Fair comes back, lots of chat there. But over to these two.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great question. I think for me, does it challenge the social relations of capital? If it doesn't, if it leaves them intact, then it's greenwashing and not a real solution.
Solid.
And I would, in the Indian context, add caste, add Brahmanism into that. And clearly, if it is as both Alex and Tom has said, if you are seeing that a corporation is there, your bells, your alarm bells must start ringing. So we better do our research better. We are not research. We've become very complacent, I would say. There's a complacency crept in because we are somehow just taken with this word agroecology. It's not a magic wand.
Yes. In the blue jumper.
Hi, thank you for your talk. You know, whenever I've gone to these talks in the last 10 years and I'm hearing words like Trump and racism and fascism and white fascism, with my roots, I always think, oh man, this is such a really lovely topic for me to dive into. Because especially when I hear white people talking about racism and I hear hardly anyone who's actually of color mentioning it. And we're talking about the hijacking of the organic movement by the fascists or the racists. The path I've been down on for the last 10 years is looking at how green is green. Like we've got in India, we've got Jharkhand, which is the biggest mining state. I looked at that because that's of religious significance to me, to Hindus and Jains and Buddhists. But they're not mining fossil fuels in Jharkhand so much. They're mining every single mineral the same as in Congo, which is so people in this room who want to go green and make the world feel how great they're doing and virtue signal at the rest of us, saying, we're going to strip away the fossil fuels from you Africans because you're using it for cheap, and we're going to get you to use it commercially so you can make our solar panels for us. My question is, I've never experienced any racism from white Joe Public on the streets. 99% of the racism and discrimination I've experienced is from the climate change movement when I'm telling them these green solutions are laden in the blood, sweat and tears of Africans and Indians and Chinese and South Americans. So where is the real fascism? It's green colonialist fascism. Get rid of your ideology that these green solutions are green and free of fossil fuels, which they're not, and free of racism and free of fascism. This is what I'm really getting sick of. It is not us this transitioning. We are helping the hedge funds like Goldman Sachs and BlackRock transition. They own the mines for the cobalt and the coal and the lithium. When are people going to wake up and realize we have, for making and extracting all the minerals for this electric car, you have just in one mine of many in Congo, 200,000 men, women and children climbing on top of each other like they're ants just to get that little bit of cobalt so we can go down this green path. If we continue down this green path, Africa and India is going to be ripped to shreds, but you'll get your green car and you get your electric panels, but eventually the mining companies will come for the UK as well. So my question is, when are we going to have honest, straight-up conversations that this green transition is the most racist and it's the biggest Ponzi scam, bigger than Enron, that I've ever seen, but somehow people have dressed it up as virtuous. Yet I see no one in the room where 50% of the people should at least be from Africa and India telling us what their perspective is. Where are the real racists? Where is the real fascism? It's in the climate change movement. Are people going to be able to stomach that while we've got children trafficked in these movements so we can live a green, virtuous lifestyle? Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, I can just, first of all, I mean, you've named it, you've said it clearly. I failed to state that the same state which is doing all this agroecology has drowned out 300,000 Adivasis by building one of the largest dams on the river Godavari. 300, that's like 300,000 indigenous people. That same state continues to mine bauxite, continues to mine, it's all Adivasi lands, it's Adivasi territories, indigenous peoples. So you're right, you're completely right, that in this climate change debates where today India is also part of carbon credits and agroecology world is also part of carbon credits. Who are we fooling? You're drowning people building dams. You're displacing communities mining their soils. And therefore, yeah, I think what you've said is just completely the truth. That we have to really call this out. We have to be really, and this is what bothers me within even the debates, the work which is happening today, and I'm not familiar internationally, I can only talk about our work in India, that it's so much now become part of the normalization of carbon credits as a solution for climate change, even in the agroecology, in this world of changing from pesticides, chemicals to natural farm. And if we don't call it out, you're very right. Because anybody who calls out the mining, anybody who's fighting against what's happening to displace and destroy the territories of indigenous people, we know that most of the folks who are being imprisoned today in our country is because that's the direct fight against capital.
Can I add a little bit extra onto what Sagari said to that? Because I totally agree with what you just said there, Sagari, entirely. What I would try and hold on to is that there are forms of green transitions that are based on imperialism and colonialism and racialised labour and violence. And then there are green transitions that we need that are led by people and led by racialised people and led by workers and they're internationalist. Because we can't continue with fossil fuels either. That isn't the dichotomy here that we're trying to pitch ourselves against. We have to have something else. And right now, the imperialist states of the EU, UK, US, and so on, what they want is an imperialist green transition where, yeah, we can continue to rely on this violence across the global south. And we can't allow that. And I would just very quickly say that there's a book, Max Isle, A People's Green New Deal, is very, very good for outlining the alternative vision that I would personally go along with.
It is racist. You cannot make wind turbines without burning fossil fuels. 700 grams of oil, 70 kilos of plastic for a wind turbine.
Yeah.
This is not green, it is racist, and it's demeaning, and it is all for a player to go back to Africa and take back and control the parts of Africa that the British did not control.
Yeah.
So this is nothing more than just more green colonialism. There's no way to actually extract resources without burning fossil fuels. I'm not going to stand by and watch these green packets actually say wind turbines and solar panels are a great solution. They're
Precisely.
green fascism through and through.
Yeah.
And there's no way around it.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the long histories, it's continuing a long history of extraction, as you're pointing out to, that didn't just start yesterday, and that's not just in this one instance, it's colouring every instance that we have in international imperial trade since the beginning of European invasion. So I think you're pointing it completely out. And I think the question that was just asked online as well, how can we distinguish? It is really, really, really difficult to distinguish. I think that's what we wanted to raise with this panel as well. We're trying to think about how agroecology, the thing that we're all fighting for and standing behind, that has origins in revolutionary, grassroots, people's-led movements, how that has become or can quickly become or slip into agendas that we are actually completely opposed to. I think this is what we were basically wanting to raise with this question as well. I want to give more people the opportunity to ask questions. We've got about 5 more minutes. I have some more online as well, if there's no one in the room.
There's one over there.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I just ask a very quick question for Sai?
You need a microphone.
Yeah, there's
it's
a
coming.
microphone coming to you.
Thank you. Just a very quick question, Sagari. What's happening in Punjab and Haryana? There's also Brahminical patriarchy in existence. I'm from the Punjab. It's very much a Brahminical patriarchal setup in Punjab, Haryana, and UP. And those farmers, as you rightly pointed out, have been leading the charge against Indian fascism, or let's call it Hindu fascism. So what do you think is going on there? What lies behind that movement?
I think that, for me, 2 things which, and I'm not from the Punjab, but what you there is something about, of course, there's Brahminical patriarchy, but I think that the fact that so two things happened in Punjab, in my view. Three things. I don't know. I'm not an expert, so please, this is just my own kind of reading. For one, this has been one of the farming communities who's experienced capitalist farming relations for the longest in India. Because, you know, the Green Revolution technology and everything which came with it started first. That's one of the... The second is that the deregulation of markets, till now, it has not happened in Punjab the way it has happened in other parts of the country. So there's a center of where you're organizing for and what you're organizing against. Whereas, say, if I compare what's happened in Andhra Pradesh, 30 years on, those regulated markets, because India, we still have that last bit remaining, there's semi-regulated markets. Those were completely diluted to a large extent. Whereas, and the primary commodity which is being grown in the Punjab, as you know, is wheat and rice. And both of them are still continued to be directly procured by the state. So there's a direct point of organizing, because if that direct point of, and also thirdly, that there's so many people's there are different kinds of farmer platforms. There are platforms which are organizing the small and marginal, really small and marginal farmer. There are platforms organizing the agriculture workers. There are platforms, also the platforms representing more middle-level farmers. The third element, which you may disagree with me, but I think Sikhism has something to play, a very important role. And of course, it is not devoid of caste. If my friend Jazz was here, he would be the best person to speak on that. But we know that Sikhism has the intrinsic, that was what Guru Nanak, Sikhism came out as a direct response against caste, the system of caste. So Sikhism has the power to, even if you look at the langar, or if you look at a certain sense of equality, or you look at women and men. Women and men the women carry kaur. Whereas if you're in the system of Brahminism, you will have to change your name as a woman when you're married. So I think these are some of the elements, but yeah.
Okay. I know we're basically at time. I would like to ask one more question to wrap it up, because I think it's an interesting one. Where is it? Yeah, so it's to what extent, I mean, we've spoken to this before, but I think, yeah. To what extent are farmers invested in land ownership and access inequality? In the UK, so patriarchal nationalists like Clarkson resonate re land inheritance. I just wanted to bring it back to that, because I think it's very pertinent right now.
Why does it resonate?
Yes, to what extent are farmers invested in land ownership and access inequality in the UK? So patriarchal nationalists like Clarkson resonate land inheritance tax.
Trying to do that quickly. Yeah, the last panel was looking at like land relations and property right, and the normalization or the naturalization of private property and land ownership, and that relationship of control. I'm going to struggle to answer that straight away right now, if that's okay. Like, yeah, in a short way.
That's all right. I think that's, we can continue that on also post-session. Maybe then we'll wrap it up here, because it's 31. Okay, thanks everyone. Oh yeah, thank you so much. Sorry, I have a whole, some notes at the end. Thank you everyone for attending. It's been really amazing and exciting, and I hope we can continue the conversation either later at the pub or over the next few days and over the next few years. I think it's only just the beginning. There's many more conversations to be had. I just wanted to point out, a reminder to grab yourself a little book of legacies on your way out. I think it should be over there. Yeah, perfect. Yes, 2 at the door, so you're welcome to take one. There's also another event tomorrow morning about this.
Yeah, it's actually Saurabh's event on living examples of reparations.
Perfect. In the morning at...
In the morning at 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock.
Where is it, Saurabh? don't know. Look in your program.
Yeah, 9 o'clock. There's also a session tomorrow morning. Tomorrow starts at 11 to continue some of the strategy building and kind of ideas of how we can actually practically then translate this into our movements. It's a 2-part session, and it's tomorrow at 11 in the Magic Common Room. So that's more like about the practical application of what we talked about today. Anyway, thank you, everyone. Thanks so much.